The room was quiet, save for the low hum of rain against the window pane, a steady drumming that seemed to cast a spell over everything in the dim light. Shadows shifted along the walls, and the soft roll of thunder in the distance added to the eerie atmosphere. The son lay huddled under his blanket, staring at his dad, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, do you think ghosts really exist?" The dad's eyes gleamed in the soft glow of the bedside lamp as he turned toward his son, leaning in close. His expression was serious, as though he were considering the question with the utmost care. He lowered his voice to a near whisper, making it feel like they were the only two people in the world. "Well," he began, his voice thick with mystery, "there's one story I read. A story that makes you wonder if some things are best left in the shadows." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "It's called The Graveyard Book, and it's no ordinary tale. It's a story of a boy named Bod, short for Nobody Owens. But you see, Bod wasn't raised like other children. His family, well, let's just say something terrible happened, something that changed his life forever." The son's eyes were wide, and he seemed to lean closer, captured by his dad's words. "Bod was just a baby when it happened," the dad continued. "One cold, dark night, a mysterious figure, a man known only as Jack, came to Bod's home. Jack was no ordinary man. He had a darkness about him, a strange glint in his eyes, and he moved as quietly as a shadow slipping across a wall. That night, Jack did something terrible, something Bod would carry with him for the rest of his life. His family, they were gone, and Bod was left all alone." The dad let the silence linger, watching as his son's eyes grew round with fright and intrigue. He continued, his voice low and steady, filled with a chilling suspense. "But something remarkable happened that night," he said. "Bod, just a tiny child, managed to crawl out of the house and find his way up a winding hill. And there, on top of the hill, surrounded by ancient trees and leaning tombstones, was a graveyard. The kind of place you wouldn't go to at night. A place where only shadows live. Or so you'd think." The son shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around his shoulders. The dad glanced around the room, as if making sure no one else could hear their secret story. The graveyard was old, filled with spirits and secrets from centuries long gone, and on that night when the spirits saw this helpless baby left all alone, they made a decision. They took him in, protected him. The spirits of the graveyard, ghosts who had lived through times of kings and battles, scholars and scoundrels, all gathered together and decided to raise Bod as their own. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. But they knew. They knew the dangers Bod faced. Jack was still out there, still searching, for reasons no one could understand. And so, Bod's life in the graveyard began, hidden from the living world, raised by ghosts who knew things that would chill any mortal heart. Thunder rumbled outside, the sound rolling through the dark room, and the dad leaned even closer, as though he were about to share a forbidden secret. Bod's new family taught him things no other child would know. They taught him how to fade, to blend into the shadows, to become invisible when he needed to hide. They taught him about the dangers that lurked not only in the world of the living, but in the world beyond. Bod learned that even the dead had their fears, things that haunted them in ways we couldn't imagine. And they warned him of one thing above all: never leave the graveyard. Because out there, in the world beyond the gates, Jack was still waiting. The son's mouth opened slightly, eyes fixed on his dad, the blanket nearly up to his chin as he absorbed each word. As Bod grew older, the dad continued, his tone now carrying a touch of pride for the character. He became braver, wiser, learning from the spirits who had centuries of experience. They were more than just spectres drifting in the dark. They were his teachers, his protectors, his family, and yet he knew he couldn't stay forever. Bod was still alive after all, and there were things he needed to understand. One day he would have to leave the safety of the graveyard. The dad let his voice fall, the suspense hanging in the air thick and electric. And then, he said, his voice barely audible, came the night when everything changed. Bod sensed something strange in the graveyard, a heaviness in the air, an unnatural silence. Somehow he knew that Jack was near, that the shadows themselves had begun to move in ways that sent chills down his spine. The man who had hunted him, the man who had haunted his dreams, had returned. The son's hands clutched the blanket and his breathing was shallow, his entire focus on the story, barely noticing the thunder rumbling just outside. So Bod, alone and afraid, with nothing but the knowledge and courage he'd gained from his ghostly family, prepared to face his greatest fear. Jack was no longer just a shadowy figure from his past. He was real, he was there, and he wouldn't rest until he found Bod. But Bod wasn't the same helpless child he'd once been. He had learned the power of courage, of loyalty, of facing the things that lurked in the dark, and when he stood before Jack, well, let's just say Bod wasn't the one who was afraid. The dad leaned back, his voice quiet but resolute. You see, sometimes, he finished, the scariest things aren't the spirits we think haunt us, but the shadows we carry with us, the things we don't face. Bod learned that facing the darkness was the only way to break free from it, even if that meant going up against the shadows themselves. The dad let the words linger, the storm outside casting eerie reflections on the walls, leaving the son in a stunned silence, gripped by the story, the rain tapping against the window like a steady heartbeat in the dark. After a pause that felt as if the whole room was holding its breath, the dad continued in a low, thoughtful tone. You see, Bod wasn't just an ordinary boy. The graveyard taught him things that most people would never know. He learned from ancient ghosts, warriors, scholars, and even children who'd once played in the same graveyard centuries before. Each of them shared their secrets with him, guiding him, protecting him. But they knew, in the end, that the real fight was something only Bod could face. The son's eyes were still wide, his imagination vividly painting every detail his dad described. Imagine it, the dad said, his voice almost a whisper, that night when Bod felt something change in the air, a heaviness, an unnatural stillness. Even the ghosts seemed to retreat into the shadows as if something powerful and dangerous had stepped into their world. And then he saw him, Jack, standing there, silent and dark, waiting. Bod knew this was it. The moment he'd feared, the moment he'd prepared for all his life. All of those ghostly lessons and ancient secrets, they had led to this. The son held his breath, feeling as if he were right there with Bod, standing before the terrifying figure of Jack. But Bod wasn't alone, the dad continued, his voice soft yet strong. He had the courage of everyone who'd come before him, everyone who had taught him how to be strong, how to be brave. And with that courage, he faced Jack. He knew he couldn't keep hiding among the tombstones forever, that facing this shadow was the only way to truly live, to honor the life he'd been given, strange and haunted as it was. The dad let out a long, slow breath, his expression softening. So you see, son, he said, Bod learned that night that true bravery isn't about never being afraid. It's about facing your fears, no matter how dark they seem. The ghosts had taught him all they could, but in the end it was Bod who had to stand up to Jack, to look into the face of the darkness and refuse to let it scare him anymore. The son's wide eyes held a glimmer of something new, a mixture of awe and understanding with just a touch of fear. He whispered, "Did Bod win?" The dad nodded, a small smile on his face. In his own way, he did. because he learned that sometimes the things that haunt us aren't as powerful as the courage we carry inside. And when we face them, we find our strength. The room was silent again, save for the gentle rain tapping against the window. The sun lay back, his mind swirling with images of Bod, of shadows and courage, and of the quiet bravery it takes to face things we don't always understand. "Good night, Dad," he finally whispered, a smile creeping onto his face. "Good night, kiddo," his dad replied softly, as the storm outside finally settled, leaving the room in peaceful silence.